Welcome to the 6th episode of the Climate on Air podcast, where we discuss the future of EU climate policy. My name is Bradlie Martz-Sigala from the Center for Climate Change, Energy and Environmental Law at the University of Eastern Finland.
And I'm Aaron Best. This is our final episode. Yes, our podcast series is coming to an end. So far, we've been talking about what transformative climate policies are, and we've shed light on 4 key challenges in reaching climate neutrality: innovation, infrastructure, investment, and integration. You can listen to our previous episodes to find out more about each of these challenge areas. Today, we want to bring it all together and talk about what future climate policies, instruments, and mechanisms should look like in order to accelerate the EU's goal to transform its economy toward climate neutrality by 2050. To discuss these matters, we've invited Bettina Kampman from CE Delft and Benjamin Görlach from Ecologic Institute. Welcome, Bettina, and welcome, Benjamin.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for having me.
Hello, Aaron. Hello, Bradlie. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you for joining us today. We're eager to delve into what's on everyone's mind, the recent elections and what they mean for the future of Europe. So let's dive right in. With the EU Parliament elections behind us and a new EU Commission coming in, what do you anticipate will be the key priorities in this upcoming legislative term, and what are the key challenges going to be for the future of the European Green Deal?
Yeah, many thanks. And indeed, it's exciting times to watch as a political thinker. So these election results, first of all, I think they do mean that Europe will find it harder to agree on ambitious climate action. For one thing, the share of parties on the right and the far right of the political spectrum has increased. It's short of the landslide that some people expected, but it was an increase in their vote and their results. And these parties generally are not very supportive of ambitious climate action. And in some instances, they also include outright climate deniers. Then the largest fraction in the new parliament, the European People's Party, EPP, actually struggled a bit to agree on a stance towards the European Green Deal, which is a bit odd because that Green Deal was actually also the signature policy of their own lead candidate, Ursula von der Leyen. But the EPP's program included elements and calls to water down or repeal certain elements of the Green Deal, most famously the ban on internal combustion engines. And the one party that is most clearly associated with ambitious climate policy, the Greens, lost in several member states, including some of the larger ones, such as Germany and France. It gained in others, but on the whole also lost a few votes. But one thing to consider here is that the election in 2019 was actually quite exceptional in some regards. It took place before the pandemic started, before the war on Ukraine started, and the energy crisis. And it happened at a time when climate change really topped the political agendas and was high up on the list of priorities. And that has changed since then. Things like immigration, crime, security, inflation have all gained in prominence. But despite that, there is still a very broad majority for climate action. So the vast majority of voters, of citizens across Europe supports ambitious climate policy, but also across the political spectrum. Not all, but almost all political parties stand behind the European climate goals. And these goals and the instruments to achieve them are at this point also quite firmly established, enshrined in EU legislation. And this is quite different, for instance, if you compare it to the US, where the issue of climate is much more polarized across the political spectrum. So what does it mean? I would expect to see some pushback against particular elements of the European Green Deal, but I wouldn't expect like a surge of anti-climate sentiment or widespread dismantling, giving up on the European Green Deal or these kinds of things. But certainly, the political tides are turning or have been turning. And so we will see is increased emphasis to align climate policy with other goals. So, for instance, to ensure that climate policy is implemented in a socially balanced way, to make sure that it strengthens Europe's international security or its geopolitical resilience. And finally, the climate policy should contribute to keeping EU industries internationally competitive.
Yes, I very much agree with Benjamin's analysis. And it is really important to stress that many important decisions have been taken in the last legislative cycle. These are in place, and these provide a really good, solid basis for EU climate policy. And it will make EU climate policy more complete and more effective. So the next legislative cycle is really about implementation of what's been agreed in the recent years, and only to a lesser extent about new initiatives. There's just a lot to be done now. So the political risk at the moment, I think, is rather that there may be a rollback or watering down of things that were already decided. It's not so much failure to agree on any new elements, but walking back on the really hard-fought compromises would be very problematic, of course, as it would undermine credibility and certainty that investors are really building on quite literally. That said, we do need a lot of implementation now, but there are some leftovers that remain on the agenda. That is the social and distributional effects that Benjamin also mentioned. They are only partly addressed at the moment with the social climate funds, so just transition funds. Industrial policy still very much in its infancy and remains to be fleshed out. And for industry, it's really important to manage this transition to a climate neutral future well. So a lot needs to be done there to basically ensure that the EU economy remains competitive. Climate target for 2040 is on the agenda, and that will be an important discussion in the coming years. And of course, we have a number of neglected sectors that require attention. Just mention a few. Agriculture is a clear one, to some extent also transport. And there are still quite a number of transformation gaps that we identified in the areas of investment, innovation, infrastructure, and integration. But we will come to that.
Even though we might be seeing less climate ambition in Europe by the sounds of it, there's still a lot on the table to implement. It's an interesting time to see what's happening and how this will all play out in the next few years and what it means for the future of the European Green Deal.
Before we speak about future EU climate policy, could you say a little more on the legacy established by the outgoing Parliament and Commission? Bettina, you mentioned that some elements have been put in place already. What are these and how far do you think they'll get us?
So the EU has formalized its goal to become climate neutral by 2050, and that is really enshrined in the EU climate law. That's the baseline for everything. For the transformation to this climate neutrality, the European Green Deal, it's really been served as the overarching vision or narrative. And this is then broken down into quite a lot of concrete elements, such as the Fit for 55 package, where some key instruments, such as the extended emissions trading and policies to accelerate deployment of renewables and a pathway to phase out fossil fuels in transport, have all been included. There was already quite a comprehensive package. A suggestion for a 2040 target is on the table. That's more recent development. And we'll see that the whole policy package has not just become deeper, so with a greater ambition and more profound change, but it has also been becoming much more broader. It's not just addressing core goal of climate neutrality, but it also introduces policies to ensure just transition, to secure competitiveness and security of supply. Those kind of issues have all become much more important in recent years. But, well, is that going to be enough? Clearly not yet, in my opinion. And that's not just our own analysis, but also quite some other experts and the Commission's own assessment show that much more action is needed and indeed possible to meet the climate goals.
So it seems clear that we need policies that drive real transformation. I recognize that a lot has been accomplished, but still we have this question in terms of implementation. Are the current policies transformative enough, and where do you see the main gaps?
If the listeners of this episode have listened to previous episodes of this podcast series, they would perhaps remember that the research project on which this is based for attraction is structured around 4 key transformation challenges. And these are innovation, investment, infrastructure, and integration. And so therefore, when we thought about what's the remaining transformation gap, we also analyzed it in those 4 dimensions. So let me walk you through these 4 challenges. For innovation, we find that progress is lacking across the entire innovation chain. And one key obstacle there is limited and incoherent funding, but also a certain lack of directionality. So we do have some steps in the right direction. Innovation Fund is one of those. It was mentioned already and has increased in size and importance, but it's not nearly enough in terms of the financial dimension. And one particular challenge is that the EU is quite well endowed actually with public R&D funding for the early stage innovation. So it's about university research. But support is lacking to get those innovations through the valley of death and lead them to market maturity. And in that account, there is still a significant gap to be established. The second dimension, investment and finance, the colleagues from I4CE estimated that there is a gap in the order of a little bit more than 400 billion euro of annual investments, which the EU would need to invest to stay on track to its climate friendly or to the pathway to climate neutrality by investing into technologies and infrastructure. But the existing policy framework that the EU has is not sufficient to mobilize this. And here, as also with the innovation part, one example of how to do it could be found across the Atlantic, where the Inflation Reduction Act in the US shows that a much bolder set of policies and incentives can actually unlock quite a bit of investment in short time. On infrastructure, we also found that the rollout of the infrastructure that's needed for a climate neutral economy is too slow, and that especially concerns energy and transport infrastructure. And part of the problem here is that the EU actually lacks a comprehensive strategy for transnational infrastructure. So there is some coordination mechanisms, but on the whole, largely the planning for infrastructure still happens at a national scale. And then finally, for integration, we found that the integration is quite uneven across the different sectors. And Bettina already mentioned that agriculture and transport are two of the sectors where you find much less climate policy integration happening. And policies in the sectors are much less aligned with climate goals. And then a second dimension here is that we also actually lack the coordination between these different other eyes. So from innovation to investment to infrastructure, the coordination across those is also still deficient.
So given these gaps that have been identified, what policy changes do you think are needed to address them? Bettina?
Well, a general observation is that the EU climate policy lacks sense of directionality. So with that, I mean that it should provide a clearer indication of where the transformation is headed in those instances where it's possible. We do have the climate target for 2050, but the way to get there is still quite unclear. Of course, we cannot know exactly what the climate neutral future will look like. There's still quite some uncertainty there, but some of the broad lines are fairly clear at this stage. For instance, we need a lot more renewable energy. Another example is that direct electrification is the most viable solution for many end users. So for transport, buildings, and industry, decarbonization can be achieved with direct electrification. Most studies indicate that the alternatives will only play a small role in these sectors. For example, green hydrogen, synthetic fuels, carbon removals. Those are all alternatives that will play a role, but we know that direct electrification is a very robust solution for many end users. So where the broad lines are sufficiently clear, I think policy can and should provide guidance, more guidance than we have now. And in this, insisting on technological neutrality can actually be misleading and cause delays. We should always remain open for better solutions, but we should not pretend that we don't know anything. We already have quite a lot of expertise with the stakeholders, what the robust solutions are.
Yeah, I'd fully agree with Bettina on this point. And this question of directionality that Bettina raised is also relevant for one of the core instruments of the EU climate policy, emissions trading as a way to establish a carbon price. And just to be clear on this one, I think getting the prices right is essential for any successful transformation strategy. There's no discussing whether we need a carbon price. We certainly need one. But although carbon pricing is crucial, it's not the magic silver bullet, right? It's not the be-all and end-all of climate policy. And one good illustration of this is the case of infrastructure. So there's many solutions that will play a role for climate neutrality, and Bettina mentioned some of these already, so things like electric vehicles or hydrogen-based steel making, etc. And one thing that many of these solutions have in common is that they require infrastructure to work well. You know, they require an expanded electricity grid. They also require perhaps hydrogen pipelines or networks. But if this infrastructure is not in place, there is a risk that these solutions will simply not be feasible to operate, or they might be extremely costly, or they might be extremely inconvenient if you don't have an opportunity to charge your car, or all of the above, costly and inconvenient and infeasible. But that means that if you don't have clarity about the infrastructure, then there's a risk that industry and private consumers are basically stranded. On the one hand, they have a high and rising carbon price, but on the other hand, they don't have really alternatives at their disposal to adjust to this rising carbon price. And that is not only unfair, but it's also politically toxic. And that's why we think that policies are needed to make sure that these alternatives are in place and are available. And then the carbon price can do its work and push green, clean technologies into the market.
This example also shows the value of policy certainty. Consumers and investors really need a credible commitment from policymakers. For example, phase-out targets for fossil fuels or technologies, they can give this kind of certainty. And if these phase-out targets would be set long enough in advance, leaves the consumers and manufacturers time to adjust. They allow for the infrastructure to be built or adapted accordingly. Basically, industry and consumers then know what to invest in. So we therefore developed a number of concrete recommendations for policies that can provide this kind of directionality and certainty, such as the strengthened EU integrated infrastructure planning and a coordinated and managed fossil fuel phase-out.
So let's dive in a bit deeper to how this change can be orchestrated. What exactly does a coordinated and managed fossil fuel phase-out look like, in your view? And why is such a phase-out necessary? What policies would it take for the EU to really deliver it? Benjamin?
Sure. So why is it necessary in the first place to manage the phase-out? I mentioned already that the EU, in its current setup of instruments, relies quite crucially on carbon pricing or emissions trading as the core instrument. And carbon pricing can play an important role in the process of phasing out fossil fuels by, for instance, eroding the profitability of fossil assets and fossil value chains. And we've seen this happening actually with coal-fired power generation, where over the last years, the rising carbon price basically reduced quite massively the amount of coal that's being used for power generation in Europe. And so some people have argued we might then just simply leave it to emissions trading, and the carbon price can basically take care of phasing out the remaining fossil usage. And the argument would be that, the price goes up, and then at some point, more and more people would just simply find it too expensive to heat their homes with oil or gas, or, drive a car that runs on diesel or gasoline. But the problem is that, of course, consumers don't have that degree of foresight necessarily, and nobody knows for sure how the carbon price is going to evolve and at what point, that's going to change the decision making. And so there is a risk that today's choices will basically trap consumers, but also financial investors into fossil-intensive lifestyles and structures that are very expensive to get out of them. And so therefore, we'd argue that there is a need for additional clear signals that give greater certainty and security for consumers and for investors alike. So what would it take to deliver that? One instrument could be to anchor timelines and end dates for fossil-based technologies in the relevant piece of EU legislation. So, for instance, anchoring phase-out targets for gas boilers in the Directive on Energy Performance on Buildings, or the Eco-Design Directive, or an end date for blast furnace steelmaking in the Industrial Emissions Directive. We actually do have some phase-out targets already. So I mentioned already the phase-out date for fossil fuels to be used in cars and vans. Where these exist, it's crucial that they remain and are not basically put in question again. One other element for this managed phase-out is to agree that the EU and the EU member states should basically end all public funding for fossil assets, but also for fossil infrastructure. At this point, we can no longer afford to invest into what will be a stranded asset a few years down the road.
Yes, and to further expand on that last point, clarity and the managed phase-out of fossil fuels also needed to deal with the infrastructure. And this really involves planning the commissioning and repurposing of the infrastructure that we currently have for the fossil-based technology. Just think about the gas grids, for example. These will not be needed anymore. At least part of these will not be needed in this future energy system. And planning this properly is also really a matter of social fairness. As more and more consumers shift away from the fossil fuels, this will mean that the cost of sustaining fossil infrastructure falls on even fewer users until the buck basically stops with the last user on the line. And that will often be someone who basically lacks the resources to make the shift away from fossil fuels. So there's quite a social dimension here as well.
So let's keep talking about infrastructure. Clearly, the infrastructure that supports our energy and industrial needs to evolve in tandem with these policy changes. But besides phasing out fossil fuel infrastructure, How can we make sure that new infrastructure is put into place and that existing infrastructure is adapted accordingly, and that these different types of infrastructures can evolve in some kind of coordinated way?
Yeah, indeed, that's a very good point, because some of these changes in infrastructure that are needed are really very drastic. For example, we need local power grid enforcements to accommodate charging of many more electric vehicles, heat pumps, local renewable energy production. We need many more district heating networks throughout the EU. We need to expand the EU-wide interconnection of the power grid. We need to create a hydrogen grid, and so on. And we find that especially energy infrastructure is really crucial to meet the climate goals in sectors throughout the EU. Think about industry, the built environment, transport. And we also need the energy infrastructure to ensure security of supply. As the share of renewable energy increases further, we see that we need more grids to accommodate that, to include that renewable energy in the energy system. Basically, the future energy system needs a very different infrastructure than the one based on the fossil fuels that we used to have. And key issues in this infrastructure development are really funding, coordination, and long lead times. These are the three key issues that policy needs to act on. And we therefore argue that there's, first of all, a need for much stronger integrated infrastructure planning, and also a need for more progress monitoring to see, are we on track for a future-proof infrastructure?
So these three issues you just mentioned, funding, coordination, and long lead times, these are big challenges. And you mentioned integrated infrastructure planning. So in very concrete terms, what does integrated infrastructure planning look like? And how does it differ from the current strategies in place?
At the moment, we already have quite a number of EU institutions and programs in place to coordinate EU-wide infrastructure planning and projects. Just to name a few, ENSO, E&G projects of common interest, the 10E, 10T funding programs such as CEF. And these existing institutions and programs are really good starting points, but we recommend to strengthen the EU role in these initiatives and to ensure the necessary transnational infrastructure is planned and implemented, for example. And to come up with two very concrete recommendations. First of all, we think the EU should really lead in developing an EU-wide integrated infrastructure plan that aligns with the EU climate goals and with the EU long-term strategy. And the second point is that we recommend to strengthen EU governance on infrastructure by designating infrastructure as one of the key dimensions of the EU Climate and Energy Governance Regulation. So this should then include strengthening and expanding infrastructure planning requirements also on the national level, so in the national energy and climate plans, the NECPs, and the long-term strategies. And there are many different types of infrastructure, quite some have been mentioned in this podcast already, and they all need attention. So there's electricity, there's heat, hydrogen, there's also roads, rail, CO2 even for the carbon capture and use or storage. However, initially, we conclude that EU infrastructure policy should really focus on expanding electricity infrastructure. That should have the highest priority now first. And the interoperability should support electrification of end users and their expansion.
So you've emphasized the importance of directionality and of certainty. And that does sound to me a little bit like a style of top-down regulation, what some might criticize as a command and control policy style. Doesn't this leave too little room for market-driven discovery and innovation?
Yeah, I understand the sentiment or the criticism. And indeed, that's why we also would not recommend to scale down the ETS. Actually, we're quite happy to see emissions trading being expanded and having a more prominent role. But we would also suggest that it may need to be complemented with additional instruments. So to be sure, we will need markets in this transition process. They're very powerful mechanisms when it comes to things like discovering new solutions and leading them to market maturity, scaling them up, but also, coordinating actions across a broad range of individuals or sectors. But Of course, markets don't exist in a vacuum. They function according to rules set by regulation. And carbon pricing, of course, is one example of such a rule that was introduced. So one function of policy is to align existing markets and making sure that the framework conditions are set in such a way that they deliver the best outcome for society and that they are aligned with the goals, including climate goals. So correcting markets, aligning markets, one of the functions, but also it might involve creating new markets where they didn't exist before. And one example that we also advocate in our recommendations is the creation of lead markets for climate neutral products. And the background is that it's already possible to produce things like steel or cement with drastically reduced emissions. But these technologies are still quite a bit more expensive than the conventional methods. And so the question is, who would want to buy these products if they are so much more expensive than the conventional alternatives? And that's where the lead markets come in. One answer to create that type of demand is by using public procurement. So the government steps in as a source of demand, using public procurement strategically to create that demand for climate-friendly steel and cement. And why would we look to government for that? Because governments themselves actually consume quite a lot of steel and cement, directly or indirectly. For instance, if you think of public construction projects or vehicle fleets operated by public agencies or bridges, school buildings, hospitals, etc., etc. We've estimated that actually public procurement in total comes to about 11% of EU greenhouse gas emissions. And that's similar order of magnitude as emissions from Spain. And much of this is actually in the form of steel or cement that the public agencies consume.
This is really interesting, Benjamin. Could you elaborate on how the procurement rules would need to be changed in order to create these lead markets for climate neutral products and services?
So at the moment, actually, public procurement in the EU does not systematically consider climate effects. So it's possible, but it's not mandated. And the primary criterion is still simply just, the most economically advantageous, or to put it differently, the cheapest tender wins. But we argue that the EU and its member states should actually harness the huge strategic potential that they have through public demand, and doing so in three specific ways. So one thing, the basis, if you want, is to develop common methodologies to calculate the emission intensity of products and to set standards to establish actually what products would qualify as climate-friendly or low emissions steel or cement. And that would be basically the entry ticket. If the product meets these standards, then they can be traded on green lead markets. The second step is to oblige procuring authorities to take environmental criteria and specifically climate criteria into account, mandating the strategic use of public procurement in the way that I've described to encourage the use of low emissions basic materials in public construction projects. And then finally, one third option that goes a bit further is to consider introducing tradable quotas or standards for end products. So to say that, for instance, in the car manufacturing sector or for construction products, a certain share of the materials used has to be sort of climate-friendly nature.
Thanks for that overview of how government policies can increase demand for these technologies. I'd like to go back to the beginning of our discussion where we spoke about the EU elections and the issue of public acceptance regarding ambitious climate policy. How can we ensure that policies are accepted by the public and the necessary funds are made available?
Yeah, I actually believe that all our recommendations are very much geared towards increasing public acceptance, or better still, actually to increase public support and ownership of the transition. These recommendations are very much about managing the transition to increase positive effects and reduce negative effects, and also about increasing predictability and provide a greater certainty to everyone involved. But in addition, we also developed a number of specific recommendations for strengthening public participation and actually also the implementation of EU climate policies. And this also includes recommendations to increase access to justice in climate-related matters across the EU, for example.
And if I can comment on this issue of funding, I would like to stress indeed that this is a crucial point for the transformation to unlock the public and private funding, to ensure that the public and private funding is available to make the transformation happen. And there's good news and bad news in this one. The good news is that, as Bettina mentioned in the beginning, we actually have increasingly a clearer picture of what needs to be done and what type of infrastructure, what type of assets we would need in this climate neutral economy. So there are some, well, no regret options, but there's some options that are quite robust across all scenarios where you say, let's, go in this direction, and the risk of misinvesting is quite limited. And the other good news is that the cost of certain key components keeps coming down. So if you think of PV modules, if you think of wind turbines, if you think of batteries, for lots of these, the cost continues to come down. And that's very good news. On the downside, rebuilding entire infrastructures is always an expensive thing to do. And many of these climate-friendly investments that we're looking at are quite capital intensive. So the cost really occurs in when you build the infrastructure, when you build the things. So it's front loaded. The capital cost is rising as inflation or as interest rates have been coming up again. And at the same time, public budgets across Europe are under pressure. So there's good and bad, and it's quite a conundrum. Resolving this, I think, would take us another episode, but fortunately, we've already covered some ground in this regard. So if you want to dig deeper into that field, episode 5 of this podcast actually did a great job with the colleagues from I4CE discussing how that green investment shift could take place. But we've also come forward with some ideas, some recommendations in one of our latest policy briefs in order to, how to scale up public funding for the transformation, public and private funding. And to that extent, we talked about developing a long-term climate investment plan for Europe and call upon private banks to develop prudential transition plans as a way of unlocking private finance. And we'll, of course, link the policy brief in the show notes.
Thank you, Bettina and Benjamin, so much for joining us today and taking the time to talk to us.
Yes, thanks for coming in and sharing your research findings with us on the future of climate policy.
Well, thank you very much, both. This has been really interesting research, and it's just so good to see that some very concrete recommendations follow from this work.
Many thanks for having us, and it was great to have the opportunity to delve a bit deeper into some of the ideas that we've developed in the 4Attraction project.
So, Bradlie, that was our final episode and discussion on these very interesting climate transition issues. What are some of your key takeaways?
Indeed, I can't believe we're already at the end. But my key takeaways from today is that a lot has already happened in the last EU cycle. We have the European Green Deal and the Fit for 55 packages that are quite comprehensive. And it seems now that the big thing is implementation. It's time to implement, and there's still gaps that need to be filled in order to address this vision we have for 2050.
Yeah, I agree. That's one of the key takeaways I had as well, that this very important foundation has been laid with those policies. One of the things that I found interesting too was this need for directionality and certainty. And I know about policy certainty, but this idea of directionality was somewhat new to me. This idea of really helping to show which direction this transition and really transitions should take that all lead up to good climate outcomes across the many different sectors that are involved here. Another key impression that I got was that market approaches, while they're very important and remain essential, they're not going to be enough for this transition due to all of the coordination problems, the need for infrastructure, the important role that government has in terms of public procurement and creating these lead markets. So that was another thing.
Absolutely. And with all that in mind as well, we can't forget about the social aspects and as well as the financial aspects to actually facilitate a successful transition so that these ideas and policies don't remain on paper, but we actually see them translate into real life action.
We started off with that discussion of the recent outcome of the EU elections. And, that will remain really essential to think through that and make sure that, the technologies are there, the pathways are there to make this happen, but we need to ensure that the political acceptance remains high as well in order for this transition to take place.
Yes, and that actually reminds me of something that Bettina said. She said we should remain open for better solutions, but we should not pretend we don't know anything. And that to me is a reminder that we're at a point where inaction in search of perfection is not a solution. We need to act now, even if it's not the magic cure-all, and that it's going to be a combination of actions and policies that actually take us to our goal. Thank you for listening to Climate on Air. For those who've been listening to us since the first episode, we hope this series has helped you connect different EU climate policy dimensions together and helps you in your advocacy, actions, and research. This podcast is part of the 4i Traction Project, financed by the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Program. For more information, check out our website www.4i-traction.eu.
This podcast was produced by Jonathan Gardner, Flora Dicke, Katri Varas, Chiara Mazzetti, Bradlie Martz-Sigala, and Aaron Best. Sound design by Lena Abli, graphic and web design by Jennifer Rahn and Beata Velvargova. Special thanks to Liliana Sala, Paul Leonard Wicke, and Matthias Duve.